King James, who was the son of Mary Stuart. We believe his real father was James Ormiston. The noblemen acquired their land through the kings and the queens of the country. And so if anything went wrong, if their relationship with Ben or whatever, the king or the queen could remove their land from them immediately. And so it's not like they owned the land, they were just assigned the land, that they will take over the name of the land sometimes. The titles of people back then were known by the name of their estate as opposed to their real name. So Mary Queen of Scots, that's what most people know her as, Mary Queen of Scots. But her name is Mary Stuart. Key persons of the drama give the names of everybody of significance in Scotland, England, and France. And those are the three main countries. There are small amounts of information that we might want to talk about from Spain, but not much, because even though Mary Stuart courted noble people and available men who may be betrothed in Spain, there were no big things going on in this time period that would have been of real issue or concern, other than maybe some courtship stuff. It's not like they were battling country to country, but in Mary's country, Scotland, England, and France, they were all kind of at odds with each other. Back then, it was all about taking over land and controlling the land that you had and being in charge. So obviously, in Scotland, James V is Mary Stuart's father. Marie de Guise-Lorraine is Mary's father's wife. Mary Stuart, she was Queen of Scotland. She's our main person here that we're talking about. So, like, Mary's father was born in 1512, and he died in 1542. Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, she was born in 1542, just a few days from when her father died. So, her whole life, she did not know her father. Then there's also James Stuart, Earl of Moray. He was an illegitimate son of James V, her father. There were many illegitimate children, as you'll see when we go through this. And back then, there was an okay thing to do. The king, before they got married, even after they got married, they had illegitimate children. They had relationships with women. And when the women had children, they were considered bastard children, but they also were taken care of by the king. Their families were given money, and sometimes they were given land. This James Stuart, Earl of Moray, the illegitimate son of James V by Margaret Douglas, he was a half-brother to Mary Queen of Scots. He caused conflict and confusion. He'd side with her, and then he would side with the other nobles and regents. But he was kind of a force against her because he was an illegitimate son, and I think he really wanted to be king and probably felt he should be king over her being queen. So there was a lot of problems that he created for her. Henry Stuart was her husband, the one she married from England. He was the great-grandson of Henry VII through his mother, Lady Lineage, who was niece of Henry VIII. So you can sort of see here how close Mary's family is to England, because they would marry the kings and queens of the monarchy. They would betroth the child. So Henry VIII is desperately trying to have boys and to take over as king and to ally with the country next door to strengthen their territory. And so there was a lot of conversation and a lot of wheeling and dealing to marry into the families of England or France. So that would have been a big deal. That way, England could more easily take over Scotland. And if she married, and she did, she was betrothed and married the son of the king in France at a young age. And so they would have been next in line for that country once if their parent passed away. So you'll find, like Lord Darnley here, Henry Stuart, he was really kind of like a cousin to her. because of the way they married their people off, arranged marriages. So they would be maybe a second cousin or a third cousin. They did that. That was kind of normal back then. Then James, who was the son of Mary Stuart. We believe his real father was James Ormiston. So there's James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell is really the estate. So he's the Earl of the estate of Bothwell, is what that means. James Ormiston had married a Sinclair. There were different Sinclair families, and they had different spellings of their name. And it's the same thing with Ormiston. There's different variations of Ormiston. There's even another Ormiston family that's written into a lot of these books that really was not James Ormiston's line, but a different line. They were more allied and loyal to England as opposed to Scotland. So those Ormiston kind of caused some problems with James Ormiston too. But James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, he and James Ormiston were helpful to each other. They were cousins through the Sinclair line, the women that they married. Their names are kind of synonymous because they helped each other out. And all of these things that they were doing for Mary, Queen of Scots, and her mother. Her mother is really kind of a key player because when Mary's father died within a week of Mary being born, Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, she took over being in charge of Scotland. The people in Scotland were rogue. They were rough. They were not genteel people. So there's always a lot of pressure on her. The nobles were always putting a lot of pressure on her to have more and be more. She was trying to maintain peace and diplomacy, and she was a French woman, but she knew how to be more genteel, but she also had to learn the rough ways of Scotland. When Mary was a young girl, James Ormiston and James Ormiston's uncle to help her out. James Ormiston was an emissary, so he was someone who'd take messages back and forth between Scotland, England, France, get on horseback and take messages back and forth between the monarchy. He was very important. Uncle Hobbs Ormiston, he was in charge of the horses for the king before the king died, and then I'm sure he continued to be in charge of the horses for Mary's mother. And they just helped out in a lot of different ways, transporting, getting on a ship to go across the channel to France and back and forth. They would escort people. They were there to help out the queen and her daughter. Then William Maitland of Lethington, he was Secretary of State to Mary Queen of Scots. It's kind of like Secretary of State for the United States. They were basically key people. These were people who helped with the whole running things in the country. Another diplomats that Mary used was Sir James Melville. There were other earls, like this is the Earl Morton, James Douglas. And most of these earls, they're all playing a game with the king and the queens of the country because they're trying to keep their land that have been assigned to them and to grow their land. And so if there was a battle that broke out, the earls would have their own military, and they might be fighting an earl of another part of Scotland. They had in-country battles and out-of-country battles, and sometimes they'd have to unite all of their military to fight off England, to fight off France. So they were separate at times, and then there are times when they were united. And then Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, father of Darnley, and chief accuser of Mary Stuart after Darnley's murder. So the Lennox family was pretty powerful, and Mary knew that if he married this guy, Darnley, that he would have a lot more right to England and Scotland. But it was a political move on her part, a strategic move on her part, and there's a lot to be said about that family. The Scottish lord and laird who sometimes supported Queen Mary, sometimes rebelled against her, were now in league, now at odds, and almost all died by violence. And they list them all there. So they'd be like the Earl of Argyll, Earl of Arran, Earl of Erskine, Earl of Gordon, so on and so forth. Those are all the different Scottish lords that are part of Mary's line. in their country. They're all trying to control their estate, and they're trying to control the king and queen, because if there's any changes with that, then their possibility of losing their land, there's risk, because whoever new comes in to take charge, they could lose their land if they're not right with the king and queen. When Jane, Mary's son, was named king, that really was a problem for all these lords, because now he was old enough and he could really rule, he can control his country. There's always a big concern that a child is going to be killed or poisoned or whatever, because then these lords have control. So as long as the child was underage, the lords were more in control of the country, and they enjoyed that. So that is a concern for all of these lords. There's the constant battle as to who's going to be in charge. And then there's the Queen Mary. These are the different Mary that were assigned to Mary, Queen of Scots, at a young age, so that she'd have playmates. That's Mary Beaton, Mary Fleming, Mary Livingstone, Mary Seton, and they were raised with her. They were like her playmate, and then they were her ladies in waiting, and they would travel with her when she was sent over to France when Mary was young. Because of all the battling that's going on after her father died, her mother, Maria de Guise, he decided to send Mary to the French court to be raised. And I think Mary was only about 4 or 5 years old when her mother sent her over there to be raised, because there was so much of a concern that she was going to be killed or harmed or kidnapped. And so he needed more protection for her. Well, these Marys went with Mary Queen of Scots. They were like her sisters almost. But they were children of the nobles, these lords, these Scottish lords. For whatever reason, they were all named Mary. And I think part of that is because it's a protection for Mary Queen of Scots, that if anybody wanted to lay blame, they could not figure out which Mary it was. And there are some things that will come up later in the story where document, like the casket letters, supposedly they were written by Mary Queen of Scots, that he was writing about her love life and about politics and this and that. And it appears that these casket letters have been doctored. Well, a couple of these Marys married into different noble families. There's one instance where one of these Mary, through the pressure of her noble husband, doctored up some of these casket letters, which was not a good light on Mary Queen of Scots. The point of that is that as these girls were growing up, they were all taught the same thing. They were all taught handwriting, so their handwriting was all the same. If later on they needed to sign something or write something on behalf of Mary Queen of Scots, their handwriting would be so close, nobody would really know if it was Mary Queen of Scots or one of her ladies in waiting. So that was something that occurred later on, where one of the Marys was used, probably against her will, I would think, but she had married into one of these noble families, and the pressure was on for them to change some of the documents. The next person on this list, John Knox, he is also somehow related, probably through marriage, to the Ormistons and the Hepburns. He was a Calvinist minister, a fierce adversary of Mary Stuart. He was constantly stirring the pot, going out there and ministering to people. And he was not Catholic. He was a Calvinist. The Ormistons were Protestant. We pronounced it as Protestant. But back then, they named themselves Protestant. They were really Protestant against the Catholic Church, but so they would consider themselves Protestant. David Rizzio, he was a musician and a secretary to Mary. He came over from France. He was murdered. This is the instance where he was murdered in her presence when she was pregnant. And it was because the Scottish lord, the nobleman, were really upset about how much attention this David Rizzio was getting from Mary. They wanted her attention, and she didn't want to pay attention to them. He wanted to be like the French people are. French people are very much loving, they're romantic, They liked nice things, and they didn't have that kind of stuff going on in Scotland. It's a very rugged, rough country, and there's not much genteelism. And so she would relax with her friends and the people that she knew in France. They would come over to entertain her, and they were jealous of this guy, and so they killed him. He had to be very strong through that whole period of time, and it was not easy, I'm sure. George Buchanan, Latin master to Queen Mary, author and tutor to King James. So obviously he was important. Then we have all the French characters and all the players, the main people in Mary's wife in France and England. Like in France, Henry II was the king of France at the time that Mary went over there to be raised in her childhood. Catherine de Medici was his wife. There was Francis, who was their eldest son, and Mary's first husband. They were betrothed at a young age. They got married when I think they were only 16 years old. He became ill and he died at a young age, which is why Mary ended up coming back to Scotland. I think she probably would have stayed in France, but when he died, that changed everything for her on the political scene. It's almost like they really didn't want her there. And he wanted to be queen. So she's like, well, I'm Queen of Scotland, so I'm going back to Scotland. And so that's why she came back, and she came back to a very rough country. She could have just resigned herself to a nice cottage in the country in France, but she decided to go back to Scotland, and that's when all of her troubles really began. Charles IX was the second son of the King and Queen of France. Henry III was their third son. Moving over here to England, there's Henry VII, Henry VIII. They're kind of big players. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife is the one that had Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. And so in actuality, Queen Elizabeth ended up taking over in England. She's about 10 years older than Mary in Scotland. So Queen Elizabeth was always very jealous of Queen Mary. Mary was beautiful, and I think Queen Elizabeth was really concerned about not being able to control her own country. So she was very political and very much always trying to protect herself and England. They are actually cousins to the Henry VIII line. Then there's the other, Mary I is the first wife of Henry VIII. They did have a daughter, and she did mature, but she died from an illness. Henry VIII's first wife, she died, and he was looking for male heirs. And so he started, just marrying all these different women. And it was Anne Boleyn who had Elizabeth. She was the only one that really survived. So the one point I want to make here is that he really wanted to divorce his first wife, Henry VIII, but because they were considered Catholic, they could not. You could not divorce. And so they actually came up with the Church of England. They came up with a new religion, Church of England, which allowed him to divorce his first wife. And then he was able to marry all those other wives. It allowed him to execute his wife and allowed him to continue marrying other wives.